I was in a Japanese butcher shop in Columbus, one of those places that's been there since 1987 and has no sign out front. And I watched the guy behind the counter do something to a piece of chuck roast that I had never seen in 15 years of cooking professionally. He didn't tell me what he was doing, but I watched every single step. And then I went home and I tested it for 3 weeks until I figured out exactly why it works. What I saw was not a marinade in the way Americans think about marinades. It was not a brine. It was not a rub. It was something between all three of those things, and it used exactly 3 ingredients that you can get at any Asian grocery store for under $8 total. And what it did to a $4 a pound piece of chuck roast was genuinely the most surprising thing I had seen in a kitchen since my culinary school days. I am going to show you everything. The 3 ingredients, why each one works at the cellular level. And I am not going to dumb that down because if you understand the why, you will never make a mistake with this technique again. I am going to show you which cuts respond best, which ones do not, and exactly what I got wrong during 3 weeks of testing, so you do not have to repeat my mistakes. Subscribe to the channel if you want more of this, and drop in the comments, what's the cheapest cut you've ever bought that surprised you? Let's get into it. The 3 ingredients. The 3 ingredients are white miso paste, sake, and kombu. That is it. If you have never worked with any of those, do not panic. I am going to explain exactly what each one does, and why the combination of the three is what makes this work, not just any single one of them alone. White miso paste is fermented soybean paste. You have probably seen it in soup at a Japanese restaurant. It is mild, slightly sweet, salty, deeply savory. In grocery store terms, you are looking at about $3 to $4 for a tub that will last you months. You do not need a specialty store for this anymore. Most Krogers carry it. Most Walmarts in larger cities carry it. If you cannot find it locally, any Asian grocery store will have it for even less. Sake is Japanese rice wine. You want cooking sake, not the fancy stuff you drink warm in a ceramic cup at a sushi bar. Cooking sake runs about $5 to $6 for a decent-sized bottle. Some stores sell it in the Asian foods aisle. If you absolutely cannot find sake, dry sherry will do in a pinch, but sake is the right tool for this job, and I want you to use the right tool. Kombu is dried kelp. It comes in flat, dark green sheets, and it looks like something you pulled out of a tide pool and left in the sun for a week. Do not let that scare you. It is one of the most powerful flavor ingredients in Japanese cooking, and it costs almost nothing. A small package will run you $2 to $3 and will last you a very long time because you only need a small piece for this technique. Those three things together are going to transform how you think about cheap beef. But before I show you the steps, I need to explain the science. Because this is not magic, this is chemistry. And once you understand it, you are going to look at every piece of cheap beef differently. Why it works, the science. Cheap cuts of beef are cheap for a reason. Chuck roast, brisket, bottom round, these come from parts of the animal that do a lot of work. The muscles in those areas are dense. They have more connective tissue, more collagen, more tough muscle fibers. That is what makes them chewy. That is what makes them frustrating when you grill them wrong. When people buy a chuck steak and grill it like a ribeye, they end up with something that tastes like a worn-out boot. What Japanese butchers understand, and what took centuries of cuisine to develop, is that the flavor potential in those working muscles is enormous. The problem is not the flavor. The problem is the texture and the way the muscle fibers grip onto that toughness and will not let go unless you give them a reason to. Here is what each ingredient does at the cellular level. Miso paste contains a significant amount of salt. That salt does what salt always does to meat when given time. It pulls moisture out of the surface through osmosis, then draws it back in along with the dissolved salts and compounds in the miso. That process is called equilibration. The salt works its way deep into the muscle tissue. It begins to denature some of the proteins on the surface. Denaturation in this context does not mean destroying. It means the protein structures are loosening, unfolding, becoming more tender before any heat is ever applied. But miso is not just salt. It is fermented. That fermentation process produces enzymes, particularly proteases. Proteases are enzymes that break down protein chains. They literally cut through the peptide bonds that hold muscle fibers together. This is the same principle behind using pineapple juice or papaya as a meat tenderizer. Both contain powerful proteases. But miso is far more controlled, far more subtle. It does not turn your meat into mush the way pineapple juice will if you leave it too long. It tenderizes with precision. Sake does several things simultaneously. It contains ethanol, which is a solvent. Solvents help carry fat-soluble flavor compounds into the muscle tissue, flavor compounds that water alone cannot deliver. Sake also contains amino acids produced during rice fermentation, particularly glutamates. Glutamate is the compound responsible for umami, that deep, savory, satisfying meatiness that makes you want more. When you apply glutamates from sake to already umami-rich beef muscle, you are amplifying the meat's natural flavor. You are not masking it. You are not covering it with something else. You are turning up the volume on what was already there. Sake also affects the Maillard reaction, the browning that happens when protein meets high heat. The amino acids in sake interact with the natural sugars in beef to produce a faster, deeper, more complex sear. When you cook a piece of chuck that has been treated with this technique, it browns in a way that looks like something you paid $40 a pound for. Kombu is where things get genuinely fascinating. Kombu is one of the highest natural sources of glutamic acid on Earth. Glutamic acid is the free-form version of glutamate, the most potent umami compound that exists. When you introduce kombu to moist beef, the glutamic acid begins to leach out and penetrate the surface of the meat. It bonds with the existing proteins and amino acids in the muscle fiber in a way that fundamentally changes how your brain perceives the flavor. There is research, actual scientific research, showing that glutamate applied to muscle protein before cooking does not just add flavor, it changes the way salt is perceived. Meat treated with glutamate tastes saltier without having more salt. It tastes richer without having more fat. Marbling, the thing that makes Wagyu Wagyu, is largely about intramuscular fat distribution. You cannot create fat where there is none, but you can create the perception of richness, of fattiness, of that mouth-coating satisfaction through glutamate amplification. That is what the kombu is doing. The three together, miso for enzyme tenderization and salt equilibration, sake for solvent delivery and Maillard enhancement, kombu for glutamate saturation, create a system that attacks the problems of cheap beef from three different angles at the same time. Nana Ruth would have laughed at how much people pay for this. This technique is older than most of the stuff they sell at the grocery store. The philosophy, how Japanese butchers think. Let me back up and give you some context because the technique does not make full sense without the philosophy behind it. When you walk into a Whole Foods and look at the beef section, everything is organized by price. Ribeye at the top, chuck at the bottom. The implicit message is that expensive cuts are good and cheap cuts are inferior, and that the only way to eat well is to spend more money. That is a marketing decision, not a culinary one. Japanese butchers, particularly the traditional ones, the guys who have been in the same shop for 40 years, do not think that way. They think about what each cut needs. Wagyu, the expensive marbled stuff, needs almost nothing. You salt it, you cook it hot and fast, you stay out of its way. The fat does the work. You do not marinate Wagyu. You do not apply enzymes to it. You treat it gently because it is already close to perfect. But a working muscle cut, a piece of chuck from a well-exercised cow, that cut has a completely different set of needs. It has deep, beefy flavor that a Wagyu ribeye sometimes actually lacks because the fat dilutes the muscle taste. It has collagen that, when properly handled, becomes gelatin, the same gelatin that gives great ramen broth and great pot roast their silky, luxurious quality. It is not an inferior product, it is a different product with different requirements. The technique I watched in that shop was not about disguising cheap beef as expensive beef. It was about unlocking what was already in that piece of chuck that American cooking, with its obsession with grilling everything hot and fast, never bothers to unlock. The industrial food people do not want you knowing this. Because if you know this, you stop buying the expensive cuts as often. You stop paying a premium for convenience. You start cooking with knowledge instead of with a credit card. The cuts. Which ones work? Not all cheap cuts respond equally to this technique. Let me be specific. Chuck roast is the best. Chuck comes from the shoulder area. It has excellent beefy flavor, a good amount of intramuscular connective tissue, and enough natural fat that it does not dry out when you apply the miso cure. I tested this technique on chuck more than any other cut and got consistent, impressive results every single time after I dialed in the timing. Brisket flat works very well, particularly for thinner cuts or sliced portions. The flat is the leaner section of the brisket. When you apply the miso sake kombu cure to a thin brisket flat steak, cut against the grain about 3/4 of an inch thick, the results are remarkable. It cooks quickly, it browns beautifully, and the glutamate saturation gives it a richness that covers for the relatively low fat content. Bottom round is the cut that surprised me most during testing. Bottom round is notoriously tough. Most people braise it or grind it. When I first tried the technique on bottom round, I expected failure. What I got instead was a piece of meat that, when sliced very thin against the grain after treatment and cooked over screaming high heat for 90 seconds per side, ate like something in a different category entirely. The enzyme activity from the miso had broken down enough of the fiber structure that the texture was genuinely close to a mid-tier steak, not Wagyu. I am not going to oversell this. but easily competitive with a sirloin that costs 3 times as much per pound. Flank steak responds well but requires shorter treatment time because it is already a thinner, more open-grained cut. Skirt steak is similar. For those cuts, you want to cut the treatment time in half compared to what I am about to tell you for chuck. More on timing in a moment. Cuts that do not work as well. Short rib, too fatty for this particular technique. Use a simple salt cure or dry brine instead. Eye of round. Works but needs longer treatment and still benefits most from slicing very thin. And anything that was already cut paper thin before treatment, because you need some thickness for the cure to have enough time to penetrate and work. The technique, step by step. Get your chuck roast. You want a piece that is at least 1 to 1.5 inches thick. Thinner than that and you risk over-curing the surface before the inside gets a chance to absorb. Take it out of the packaging. Pat it completely dry with paper towels. This step is not optional. Surface moisture is the enemy of both the cure and the eventual sear. Dry the surface thoroughly. Now make your cure. You want 3 tablespoons of white miso paste, 2 tablespoons of sake, and 1 4-inch piece of kombu. Put the miso and the sake in a bowl. Stir them together until the miso is fully dissolved into the sake. The resulting mixture will be a thin, savory paste, pale brown, intensely fragrant. Take your piece of kombu and score it lightly on both sides with a knife. You are not cutting through it. You are just opening up the surface so it releases its glutamic acid more efficiently. Lay your scored kombu flat in a rimmed dish. Set your dried chuck roast on top of the kombu. Spread the miso sake paste across the top and sides of the beef. Use your hands. Get it in there. You want an even layer, not thick, not dripping, just a solid, uniform coating. Flip the beef. Apply paste to the other side and the remaining edges. You want the entire surface of the beef in contact with either the cure or the kombu. Cover the dish with plastic wrap. Into the refrigerator. This is where the timing matters enormously and where I made mistakes during testing. The minimum effective time is 4 hours. At 4 hours, you are getting early enzyme activity and some salt penetration. The texture improvement is noticeable, but subtle. The sweet spot is 8 to 12 hours. I found 12 hours overnight to be the ideal window for a 1.5-inch thick chuck steak. At 12 hours, the enzyme tenderization is significant, the salt has fully equilibrated through about 2/3 of the thickness, and the glutamate from the kombu has penetrated the surface layer deeply enough that the flavor difference is dramatic. Do not go past 24 hours on a cut with significant thickness. The miso's enzyme activity does not stop. At the 24-hour mark with a thinner cut, like flank or skirt, you will start to get a texture that is too soft, almost pasty on the exterior. It is edible but unpleasant. The window I recommend, 12 hours for chuck, brisket flat, and bottom round, 6 hours for flank and skirt. If you forget and leave it to 18 hours on chuck, you will be fine. Past 24 is when you start losing control. When you pull the beef out of the refrigerator, you are going to scrape off the miso paste. Do not rinse. Rinsing removes flavor compounds from the surface. Use a spatula or the back of a knife to scrape the paste off cleanly. Then, and this is critical, dry the surface again with paper towels. The miso treatment will have pulled moisture back to the surface during the cure process. You need to get rid of that moisture before cooking. If you cook it wet, you will steam the surface instead of searing it. You will get gray, not brown. You will be disappointed and blame the technique when the technique was fine. You just did not dry the meat. Let the beef sit at room temperature for 30 minutes after you scrape and dry it. Cold meat in a hot pan drops the pan temperature dramatically and gives you an uneven cook. 30 minutes takes the chill off. The center of the meat will still be relatively cool. That is fine. But the first inch or so from the surface will have warmed enough to make a real difference in how the sear develops. Now cook it. You want the highest heat you can get. If you have a cast iron skillet, this is its moment. Get it on high heat for at least 3 minutes before you add anything. The pan needs to be genuinely ripping hot. Add a thin layer of a high smoke point oil. Avocado oil, grapeseed oil, refined coconut oil, any of those work. You do not need much. Just enough to coat the bottom of the pan. Lay the beef down. Do not touch it. Do not press it. Do not lift the corner to check every 30 seconds. Let it work. For a 1.5-inch thick chuck steak, you are looking at 3 to 4 minutes per side for medium rare, an internal temp of around 130 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of the miso treatment and the altered protein structure, this cut will cook slightly faster than untreated beef of the same thickness. Use a thermometer. Pull it early if anything. You can always put it back on the heat. You cannot undo overcooked. When you pull it, rest it on a wire rack or a cutting board for at least 8 minutes. I know that sounds like forever when you are hungry. Rest it. The internal temperature will carry over another 5 to 8 degrees. The juices that were pushed to the center during cooking will redistribute through the muscle. If you cut into it immediately, those juices run out onto your cutting board, and you have just made a less satisfying piece of beef. Slice against the grain, always against the grain. Find the direction the muscle fibers run and cut perpendicular to it. This is not a suggestion. Cutting against the grain shortens the muscle fibers in each bite, which makes a dramatic difference in perceived tenderness. Even a well-tenderized piece of chuck, cut with the grain, will feel chewier than it should. Against the grain, it eats in a completely different category. What I tested, what worked, what didn't, what surprised me. I spent 3 weeks running iterations on this technique before I was satisfied that I understood it well enough to teach it. Here's what actually happened. First 3 attempts, I over-marinated. I was impatient in the wrong direction. I thought more time meant more improvement. The 22-hour attempt on a flank steak gave me meat that was tender in the wrong way. The surface had a slightly mushy quality that I did not like. I backed off to 12 hours for thick cuts and 6 for thin cuts, and the results improved immediately. I also initially used red miso instead of white miso on one batch. Red miso is more intensely fermented, more salty, and has a stronger, almost funky flavor profile. It overpowered the beef. White miso is milder, slightly sweet, and lets the beef flavor remain the star. Use white miso. The technical term for white miso is shiro miso. If you are reading a label, that is what you are looking for. The batch that surprised me most was a $20 bottom round roast that I sliced into 3/4-inch steaks before treating them. After a 12-hour cure, cooked in a cast iron skillet 2 minutes per side over high heat, those steaks ate so well that I made my neighbor try one without telling him what the cut was. He guessed sirloin. He was not close to right, but he was also not embarrassed by his guess. That should tell you something. What did not work? I tried applying this technique to pre-marinated beef from the grocery store, the stuff that comes in a vacuum-sealed bag already sitting in some sort of seasoning liquid. The results were genuinely bad. The pre-existing moisture and whatever industrial flavoring was in that bag fought with the miso cure in a way that produced off flavors I did not enjoy. Start with raw, dry, unmarinated beef. Clean canvas only. I also tested sous vide in combination with this technique. Treat the beef with the cure, then cook it sous vide at 130 degrees for 2 hours before searing. The results were technically impressive. The texture was extraordinarily consistent edge to edge, but the Maillard reaction on the sear was slightly less dramatic than the dry pan method, and I felt it lost something in the process. The skillet method is simpler, and the results, in my opinion, are better for this particular technique. The mistake most people make. I have already mentioned some of them, but let me be direct about the biggest ones. Not drying the meat before cooking. This is the single most common mistake. Wet surface equals steam equals gray, disappointing sear. Dry the meat, then dry it again, then dry it one more time. Cooking cold meat. If you take a piece of beef directly from the refrigerator and put it in a hot pan, the pan temperature crashes, the exterior overcooks while the interior struggles to reach temperature, and you get an uneven result. 30 minutes at room temperature. That is all it takes to fix this. Underheating the pan. American home cooks are scared of high heat because of smoke alarms and because most of their pans are thin stainless or non-stick that genuinely cannot handle serious heat. Get a cast iron skillet. Season it. Use it. High heat without a capable pan is a problem. High heat with cast iron is how you get results that look like a restaurant. Cutting with the grain. I said it earlier. I will say it again. Slice against the grain. Every time. For every cheap cut. This alone will change how you experience beef more than almost anything else you can do. Skipping the rest. 8 minutes minimum. Set a timer. Walk away. Eat your vegetable while you wait. Why the industry doesn't want you knowing this. The industrial food people do not want you knowing this because knowledge is the enemy of the premium markup. The entire structure of the American beef market is built on a hierarchy that is only partially about actual quality. Ribeye commands 3 to 5 times the price per pound of chuck, but a significant portion of that price premium is about perceived value, convenience, and the assumption that people do not know how to do anything with a cut that requires technique. If every home cook in America knew this technique, if everyone understood that 3 ingredients costing less than $10 total can functionally transform a $4 a pound cut into something that competes with far more expensive beef, the demand for cheap cuts would rise, the price for those cuts would follow, and the whole system of premium markings on ribeye and New York strip would face pressure it is not prepared to handle. That is not a conspiracy. That is just market economics. Ignorance benefits the seller. Knowledge benefits the buyer. Nana Ruth used to say that the best cooks she ever knew were the ones who couldn't afford to be bad cooks. When money is tight, you learn technique. You learn every trick the expensive restaurants are hiding. You learn that the expensive ingredient is usually just the lazy person's shortcut. She was right then. She is still right. This technique is not new. It has existed in Japanese butchery culture for longer than supermarkets have existed in America. It was not invented by a food scientist or a celebrity chef. It was developed over generations by people who respected every piece of meat that came through their shop and refused to accept that a working muscle cut was inherently inferior. It just requires knowing what to do with it. How to store and scale this technique. Once you understand the 3-ingredient cure, it scales. Make a larger batch of the miso sake mixture and keep it in a jar in your refrigerator for up to 2 weeks. The kombu can be reused once. After your first cure, rinse the kombu piece and let it dry. Use it one more time. After that, it has given most of its glutamic acid and you will want a fresh piece. You can also vary the technique with what I call a dry cure variant. Instead of the full miso sake paste, you mix 2 tablespoons of dry white miso, 1 teaspoon of sake that you let evaporate to concentrate it slightly, and powdered kombu. Powdered kombu is available at most Asian grocery stores or online. This dry version clings to the surface differently and produces a slightly different texture on the crust, a little more firm, more bark-like, which works exceptionally well with brisket flat if you are planning to smoke it before finishing in a pan. For thinner cuts, skirt steak, hanger steak, flat iron, cut the paste quantity in half and reduce the treatment time to 4 to 6 hours. Thin cuts are already more tender, and the enzyme activity moves faster through less thickness. You want to season them and amplify their flavor, not over-tenderize them. If you are treating multiple cuts at once, place them in a single layer if possible. Stacking prevents even contact between the paste and the surface. If you need to stack, apply paste to the top of the bottom piece and the bottom of the piece going on top, so all surfaces get coverage. One more thing, the kombu itself, after curing, should not be thrown away. Rinse it, cut it into strips, and use it in a broth. Put it in a pot of cold water, bring it to just below a simmer, remove the kombu, and you have a simple dashi, Japanese soup stock, that you can use as the base for soup, for braising liquid, for anything that needs depth. Nothing goes to waste in a Japanese butcher shop. Nothing should go to waste in your kitchen either. The bigger picture. This technique is one example of something that runs through almost everything I make on this channel. The gap between what you pay and what you eat is almost never about the raw ingredient. It is almost always about the knowledge applied to that ingredient. Wagyu beef is extraordinary. If you have the money and the occasion, eating real Wagyu is an experience worth having. But the idea that you need to spend $40 a pound to eat beef that satisfies you deeply and tastes genuinely complex and rich, that idea is a fiction that the food industry has worked very hard to sell you. It is not true. It has never been true. A $4 a pound chuck roast treated with white miso, sake, and kombu, rested at room temperature, seared in a cast iron skillet over high heat, sliced against the grain after an 8-minute rest. That piece of beef will change how you think about cooking. It will change how you think about price. And once you understand why it works, you will start seeing applications everywhere. I am going to keep putting out techniques like this. Real techniques, with the science explained, from a guy who spent years in professional kitchens and grew up on a 200-acre farm where you used everything and wasted nothing, because wasting food was not something we could afford to do and not something we believed in anyway. That is what this channel is. If that is what you are looking for, you are in the right place. Subscribe, drop a comment, and next time you are at the store, walk past the ribeye and pick up the chuck. You know what to do with it now.